So we will now start the Q&A portion of our session, and we're at the point really where the lunch time, the half hour is over, but Kim has indicated that she's able to stay on and address some of these questions. And for those of you who have to disconnect, just remember that this is being recorded and will be on our website. So Kim, I've been watching the questions come in as I'm listening, and so multitasking here, trying to see if some of these questions have been addressed already. So I'll go through them in order, and there might be some where you did address it and I missed it, so I apologize in advance. But the first question is, it seems to be more on after the audit is complete. Do you see any challenges in getting the regulators to agree on whether a company has resolved inspection findings, and will industry experience a delay in I guess, basically getting indication that the inspection findings have been resolved?
So with my experience to date before I left FDA, I would have to say not directly with respect to the particular audit. What I did experience or did view is that because different regulators are using the audit reports in different fashions. So I mentioned how FDA was basically replacing it for a routine audit report. And also, if it doesn't meet that trigger, then FDA is not really going to be looking at it or involved in the audit findings. It's either going to be classified as no action indicated or voluntary action indicated and moved on. But for some of the other regulatory jurisdictions where the audit report is used for an application purpose, I have seen not so much a delay in resolving the audit findings. That's still pretty much between the manufacturer and the auditing organization. But I have seen sometimes where the auditing organization might not have covered something very specific to the application that's in front of the regulator, and the regulator was hoping to get that information in the audit report, where there was a necessity to have the auditing organization go back and gain or glean some additional information. So it's not so much a delay in closing out the audit, but it's further follow-up when there might be some specific regulatory application in front of a regulator that might require some additional time or follow-up.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's a question on, will there be enough qualified auditing organizations to provide needed audits to all firms in the Canadian medical device market? And if not, what can we expect from Health Canada in terms of modifying transition timelines? So I don't know if you can speak on behalf of Health Canada, but maybe you can share what you think at least.
So I definitely cannot speak on behalf of any of the regulators now, especially Health Canada. But again, all you have to really do is look at the very, very firm April Q&A document. And I do not anticipate the fact that they are giving people over 2 years plus the pilot program the time to transition, that you should expect to have much of any leeway when it comes time to that January 1, 2019 date. So you already, were given over 2 years notice, and that really truly is, plus the 3 years is almost 5-year notice that this is happening. Now the question about, are there enough auditors? Well, the flip side is that the auditing organizations have continually told people that this is a business for them, and they can't pull auditors out and have them trained and determined to be competent without the necessary business demands from their clients. And so it's really a chicken and the egg, where manufacturers actually have to talk with their auditing organization and show interest, even if it's in the future, such that they can appropriately plan to have the necessary resources and competencies of those resources to perform the job. So at this, actually, as of February this year, so February 2016, all 14 of the Health Canada ChemCAS auditing organizations had applied. Several of them have gone through and are doing MDSAP audits. I believe that number is still 5. Several of them are actually sitting there waiting. They need to have a witnessed audit for their first one and then 2 additional ones in their first year, and they are sitting there waiting to have clients ask for the MDSAP audit in order to be able to satisfy their requirements. So it really is up to the manufacturers now to step up to the plate and to talk with the auditing organizations and get this on their radar screen. But I really do not anticipate a whole lot of leeway when it comes time to that January 1, 2019 date.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple questions related to expanding the MDSAP program by adding other regulators. So one is in general, is there something on the horizon where you envision other regulators joining in, and then one is specific to Mexico, which currently accepts registration decisions taken by FDA, Health Canada, and Japan.
So the answer to the first part is the intention was never to expand MDSAP. The only country that was offered to be included, again, was the EU. And if the EU, if they would ever be able to get over the hurdle of the confidentiality arrangements, then the EU would be the one. It was very early stated and put into the mission statement that the intent was not to continually expand, because what that does is it almost makes the audit, the single audit, too unruly. The goal was, as I've mentioned, to develop a very consistent, predictable, and transparent program such that other regulators would utilize the end results, but not add into their particular requirements into the audit. So it would not officially expand the requirements, it would not officially expand the consortium. That it would be up to other, especially the emerging regulators, to be able to utilize that. WHO has a document that's gone out for public comment twice right now and should be finalized here soon. It's a document to emerging regulators on how to leverage aspects from more mature regulators, and the MDSAP program and utilizing the end results of the MDSAP program is really mentioned and talked about, and that's the intent. So not to add requirements in from all the different Asian countries and Pan-American countries and everything else, because then the audit gets ridiculously long, and it's already approximated at a 56 to 60 some hour audit, which would require typically 2 auditors for a good 5 days for a comprehensive certification audit. If you keep adding more regulatory requirements, that just gets to be unruly. So the intent is not to. So therefore, countries such as Mexico, where there's already agreements in place, or even if there's not agreements in place, there is the ability for the manufacturer either to work directly with the governments to utilize those results or to work with the manufacturers. So the manufacturers could provide the MDSAP cert to some of these other regulatory agencies, or if the regulatory agencies wanted to actually have the MDSAP audit report, they could go and directly request that from the manufacturer versus from the regulatory consortium. And this is how the program foresees the utilization on a broader global scale.
That's great. Okay. Under 21 CFR 820-180, there's certain records that are excluded from FDA review during inspections, but there's not a comparable exclusion in audits to ISO 13485 and EU. How is this difference handled under MDSAP?
Well, having written that requirement and understand why we put it there, and I won't, but I mean, if I ever had the opportunity to revise the regulation, I would have taken those exemptions out, because in reality, over the past 15 years, with regulatory auditors, maybe not FDA auditors, already reviewing those documents, it really becomes irrelevant. It truly does. So for MDSAP, those documents are fully open to the auditing organization's auditors. And again, the information that's in the MDSAP audit report is only when there are deficiencies. And these are process deficiencies or procedural deficiencies. And so it's not getting into financial records or anything else like that from a management review. So it really is not going to be a problem. It hasn't been a problem even as early as the 90s, when there was other shared inspections in the PMAP program that I mentioned with Health Canada. So those documents will be reviewed just like they are under the current 13485 regulatory audits by different groups already.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I was looking, there's a couple questions here related to, I think, more to the scope. So one is, what if they're, like, how is it handled when there's a company with multiple sites under a single ISO certification, and then another one where, let's say the company is only selling to US and Canada, so will the other regulatory requirements in that situation be excluded from the audit? Okay, so let's handle the first example, and the scope as far as how manufacturers want their certificate to be scoped is really still a decision between the manufacturer and the auditing organization and the general rules around certificates. I would caution people to be careful. I have found, especially now that I'm on the outside of the regulatory agency, that several auditing organizations have, for ease in certification program,
been advising companies to put many different facilities under a single certificate scope, but I will caution the fact that rarely, and I have not seen one successful, where they are all under the same QMS. And you just have to recognize when you put everything under one certificate, if there is a regulatory problem with one aspect or one facility under that certificate, it has the potential to affect all those other facilities. But that really is a decision between the client, being the medical device manufacturer, and the auditing organization, and that's really not something outside of the general requirements of how auditing organizations have to issue certificates. Is not being dictated by the regulators. The second part of the question was the scope with respect to regulatory jurisdictional requirements. And it's really quite simple. If you market in that country, you are required to have those regulatory requirements audited under MDSAP. And now with the new 1345 2016 version, it explicitly requires that even under 1345. So even under 1345, even if the auditor was coming in to, for example, audit you under the European notified body, if there was technically a requirement, for example, of Health Canada that wasn't followed, that European notified body is required under 1345 to write that as a nonconformance against 1345. So from an MDSAP scope, if you sell in that jurisdiction, they have to be included in the scope of the MDSAP. If you don't sell in that jurisdiction, then they don't have to be included. But I will caution people to think strategically and far enough advance as to how and what they want their MDSAP audit report to be leveraged by the particular jurisdiction. Quickly, let me just give you an example. So maybe a manufacturer does not currently market in Brazil. They could choose not to have the Brazilian requirements audited at their next MDSAP audit, and that would be perfectly legitimate. However, that audit report then could not be used by Brazil to support an application that they might enter in maybe 9 months or whatever, within that time frame. So you do have to strategically look ahead to determine whether you might want to market in that jurisdiction in this near future, such that if you want to depend upon that MDSAP audit, that jurisdiction would have to have been included in the scope. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, great, thank you. Are you aware of any training that is offered to industry to help prepare for MDSAP audits?
Well, NSF has several different trainings. I have a full-day training on MDSAP. I have a 2-day training on MDSAP. So clearly you are most welcome to look at NSF's training website to explore further training opportunities with NSF. Obviously, I have spoken, at MedCon with Xavier and at several other trade shows to try to continue to educate people on the basics of MDSAP. But there really is a lot of documents that you can access publicly available on the FDA website, but really it's important to get into the MDSAP audit model. The companion documents have got some excellent information. It's important to understand the nonconformity grading system. It's important to understand the audit time calculation. So there's a lot of very specific training around some of these documents that aren't mandatory for manufacturers, but for you to truly understand the program and understand your preparation for the audit, it is valuable. So I do ask you, if you are interested to explore NSF's training website more about some of the 1-day and 2-day trainings that we have available on MDSAP.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple questions here, so I'm going to try to combine them the way I'm seeing these. And it seems to be around the realm of sharing these audit reports between regulators. And so one of the questions is, with the 5 regulators that are regulatory authorities that are involved in the consortium, I guess, is that information shared only related to those regulators who have been involved in the MDSAP program? And one of the questions is also, which countries have confidentiality agreements with all 5 countries that are MDSAP members? So, and I think what they're asking for there is, even though EU is not actively involved and they're observing, would they have access to this information? And I'm thinking back to when you were saying during your conversation that really you guys have been doing this for a long time without the formality of MDSAP. So I'm wondering if these questions are even relevant, knowing that you guys share information anyway to help each other be prepared. So
Yeah, so let me just help. So FDA quite openly on the FDA, under the Commissioner's Office, there's the International Programs Office that quite openly puts on the website all the different international agreements it has with the different commodities that FDA regulates. So you can go in and see what countries, whether it be European or not, that FDA has confidentiality agreements with. And look for, obviously, medical devices, because not all of them, not every country has one for all commodities. So you can see who FDA already has, and they constantly update that list as well. So that's publicly available information as far as FDA is concerned. I don't know if the other regulators have that type of information publicly available, but again, from an FDA perspective, that is publicly available. From the consortium perspective, of course, anything that happens within MDSAP as the consortium, that information is obviously available to the 5 consortium members, whether their country-specific requirements were in scope or not. But again, why does, I mean, no regulator has time to look for things that they don't need to. So if Brazil didn't, if the Brazilian requirements were not in scope in an audit, the only time the Brazilian Anvisa are really looking for an audit, number one, is if it's flagged as a problem because of the trigger I mentioned, or if the manufacturer has an application in front of them by which they're going to want to go and try to find that and utilize that audit report. So practically you can see how it's being utilized. One question that I frequently get is the fact that, of course, is it publicly available through FOI? When I was with FDA and I did request and did receive legal counsel from the international lawyers in the Commissioner's Office, the decision is that this is not an FDA document, that this is it's a consortium-owned document. It's a document that is owned between the manufacturer and the auditing organization. However, in the contracts, the auditing organizations give the manufacturer is acknowledging and giving permission for sharing with those 5 regulators. If a manufacturer decides to use the MDSAP audit and provide it to another regulator, that may put it into the public domain, but it is not the same as an FDA audit report, which is an FDA work product, which has certain rules under the Freedom of Information Act. These audits are not FDA property. They are the consortium's property and are governed by different rules as far as information disclosure against U.S. laws.
Okay, and then the clarification came in just now saying the question was maybe more specific to the manufacturer. Are the reports shared with the consortium if the manufacturer is not participating in MDSAP?
So there are many reports that may be shared already, yes, but outside the MDSAP program mechanism.
Right. Okay. Great. And then I just have maybe a couple of very specific questions. I guess how does this impact notified body audits where they are required to do unannounced audits?
So under the MDSAP program, under the INDRF requirements, there is a provision for what is called special audits, and an unannounced audit is one type of special audit. So under MDSAP, the auditing organizations can also do unannounced for the reasons dictated in the program. However, the whole EU notified body scheme is different from that trigger. We did try to coordinate that, but the Europeans decided they needed to have something more frequent, so they went with the current unannounced audit program. But those unannounced audits really won't tie into the MDSAP unless the auditing organization has to perform an unannounced audit under MDSAP at the same time as coordinating it with the requirement for an unannounced audit in the EU. So that's one thing where it's really whether the auditing organization can and should join that, but typically those unannounced audits are not going to be part and parcel of the MDSAP program or utilization under the MDSAP program. Okay.
How often are MDSAP audits required to be conducted?
So it follows the same certification scheme, which is also similar to the EU, where you have a certification, a surveillance, and then a recertification. So it's a 3-year certification cycle.
Okay, great. And if follow-up is required, will the same regulatory authority perform that audit, or can a different member of the consortium perform it?
So I think the questioner is a little confused. So the auditing organization that is not a regulator is performing the audit. And again, the first line is still to continue with that auditing organization manufacturer relationship. If a regulator does need to follow up, it depends on whether it is an issue that is particular to a particular jurisdiction. If it is, then the consortium will let that particular jurisdiction follow up. If it is general QMS, quality management system type issues where it would affect all the consortium members, the goal is to coordinate and have either one jurisdiction or a team of regulatory auditors to go in to perform that follow-up.
Great. Then I have a couple questions related to, obviously these inspections or audits are being conducted against different sets of quality system requirements that come from these different regions. And so is there any work going on to align those requirements in general for devices, but then also there is a question specific to combination products. Do you see that being kind of spelled out and harmonized a little bit more?
So, what is already spelled out and harmonized is all captured in that MDSAP audit guide or audit document. The audit model has already laid out a very, very formal process approach plan by which the requirements utilizing 1345 as the base, then adding particular country regulatory requirements on top of that in a smooth process flow model. The nice thing that some of the additional requirements that are listed under the current audit and companion document are going to go away because the harmonization effort was very good in this last 1345-2016 revision, where many of the particular requirements were already incorporated now into the new revision of 1345. So utilizing 1345 as a base, some of those particular requirements are not going to be necessarily have to be called out because they are subsumed in that core harmonized, converged, standard. So the efforts over the past 25 years, starting in 1994 when TC 210 was formed in order to author the 1345, has continued to progress and to converge those quality management system requirements specifically. And it's very nice and neatly laid out in the audit on the audit model and further explained in the audit model companion guide. As far as combination products are concerned, combination products are already under MDSAP for many of the jurisdictions. I will have to caution, even in the U.S., it has been used for lower class devices, but because U.S. FDA does not use MDSAP for pre-approval inspections, most of the newer combination product PMA and pre-approval inspections are still required, and the U.S. FDA still has the rather unique requirement of combining both the GMP requirements for drugs as well as the quality management system for medical devices, and that is not fully covered in all the MDSAP documents. So combination products are a difficult topic as far as regulatory convergence is seen, because most other regulatory jurisdictions either classify them as a medical device or a pharmaceutical and then full stop. It's handled under those respective schemes, where U.S. FDA is a bit novel in the fact that it has a combined scheme with the combined requirements. But that hasn't stopped many combination product manufacturers, again, especially for those that have already been through the FDA pre-approval process or for lower class devices and utilizing MDSAP audits both in the U.S. as well as the other regulatory jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you. There's a question that asks, is there any consideration for drug inspection? So I'm wondering, maybe you can shed some light on differences you see in the progress and potential of what's going on the drug side with mutual reliance compared to the progress that's been made on the device side with MDSAP.
So the mutual reliance program was in close contact with myself and the MDSAP program for many years. We have shared information across the two programs back when I was at FDA, and there are some differences. The mutual reliance program for pharmaceuticals is primarily focused right now with the U.S. and the European Union, and there are definitely similarities, but the difference is in the European medicines scheme is they don't use third parties. In the medical device scheme, many of the regulators are using a third party scheme. So it was easier on the medical device scheme. You know, even FDA had in 1999 started that third-party inspection program, and the third-party scheme really provides a different uniqueness, if you will, than the pharmaceutical reliance. The other thing that the pharmaceutical or drug side has is that in Europe, for example, they do have a central agency. The European Medicines Agency is a central agency by which the US FDA has a one-to-one counterpart with, where on the device side there is not that same one-to-one counterpart. While the EU Commission clearly has a medical device division under the Commission does not speak on behalf of all 28 member states as a unified union. It still has to go to the 28 member states. So there is not that one-to-one regulator to one regulator ratio on the device side like there is on the drug side. So on one hand, there's similarities. There's been a lot of information at FDA shared between the two programs, as well as the third-party program for foods. There was a lot of sharing there as well. But there's similarities and differences that are innate in the way global regulators regulate the different commodities.
Great. Okay, thank you. And we have a few questions left, but being respectful of your time, I'll just ask one more. Will each of the 5 countries' regulators assess the initial audit with the manufacturer that has transitioned over to MDSAP?
So no, the direct relationship between the manufacturer and the auditing organization is what is still key. So very similar to how the Health Canada CAMDCAS program operates for the past 15 years is how MDSAP will operate. The only reason that the regulators should be involved is one of two purposes. A is if that trigger is reached and there's concern, or two, during the pilot and I see even in the initial years, there is outreach by the consortium to manufacturers that has been involved in order to try to continue to optimize and make the processes more efficient. So there are surveys that are sent to the manufacturers. Again, you can see those surveys. They're on the FDA MDSAP webpage, constantly soliciting feedback as to how things can go better, what issues are happening, how can the program evolve and be beneficial to both the regulators and the manufacturers. So there the manufacturers might be engaged by the regulators in order to how to optimize the program, but from on a normal routine basis, if that non-conformance grading trigger has not been literally triggered, then you wouldn't be having the relationship with the regulatory agency. You would have the normal relationship between the manufacturing and the auditing organization.